committed forever and ever. So the idea behind today is just to look at a few basic ideas on how to improve coursework. Mainly this is kind of more oriented to level 4, but you know it's easy to get things over Christmas and breaks and so on, and always useful, I think, to have a bit of a refresher and a reminder. So chiefly what we'll look at is the issue of paraphrasing, which is something that a lot of people get confused with, and unfortunately is one of those things that if you get it too wrong too often can result in awkward questions about plagiarism, and then you have committees and things that you have to explain things to, and it all gets a bit heavy. In-text citation and the library are more than happy, in fact eager, to come and do sessions explaining precisely how to reference everything down to the last possible variation. So if you would like a session of library referencing, do shout, and I will organise somebody from the library to come in, but this is just kind of basic type citation, so that people can make sure they're doing the correct type, and evidencing, and a bit of attention to academic language. So first thing to bear in mind, and this obviously is more for the benefit of level 4, because by level 6 you will be fed up with the amount of books and journals and Lord knows what else you have to wade through. But the reason, if you are ever bored enough to watch University Challenge and you get lots of people saying, I'm Gladys from Reading and I'm reading history, the reason they say that is because you are meant to read and read and read and read until your eyes cross, and then read some more in order to improve the quality of work. And that should be reflected both in the sort of nature of what you're committing to paper or doing as a presentation. And mostly this is about the written version. So we do very briefly mention presentations in this, but if you'd like a session specifically going into more depth on how to do really good presentations, I can organise that as well.
Have you got any tips on range things? I either, when I'm reading, have to read it like 3 times over because it just doesn't seem, or I'll read for a little bit and I fall asleep. I never used to be, obviously, because I did my nursing and whatever. But now, well, psychobiology book, actually, I'm going through the first chapter because I keep falling asleep. I fell asleep on my chair like this at home, on my desk, like a 14-year-old in geography. I just can't.
One option to consider is reading into a dictaphone and then listening to the playback, so that you get the second version of it as audio rather than read.
I wish they would do more as audio books.
They don't tend to so much with academic works.
No, I wish they would. You know what
I'm being pulled by gas, they're recording.
Just like how if you buy a book, you have to scan the thingy and code in.
Yes.
And be able to link back to them.
Dragon's Den idea. I think it's Dragon's Den.
You can get those devices that they advertise on TV now, where it looks like a kind of a pen light, and you scan the page and it reads it to you, little voice.
I've got one here.
Is that the scribe?
And it's crap.
Is that the scribe?
Yeah. Not very well when it's like a funny language and there's no like expression to it. So
it's a robot voice, basically.
Worse than like the computer does. It's just, and I went to the shop and there's just you can't.
No humanity to it. Yes. Level 4, mainly what you're being encouraged to read with the reading lists in your handbook are books with usually the word introduction to somewhere in the title, which is fantastic. When you get to level 5, you don't have to stop reading those books. The assumption is that you will no longer be citing them in your reference list. So you can certainly read them and get some ideas from them, but the hope is that you'll be moving from the introductory text onto something a bit more challenging, a bit more in depth. So if your level 5 work has lots of introduction to this, that and the other in the reference list, you get some kind of snotty comment saying, oh, you must read more deeply, and take you into a deeper level.
Okay, was my niece.
That is very generous of you.
Robin, do you want us to wait till you get
No,
on this
no.
part, or can I just ask a question?
Yep, far away.
Firing its way around my brain. It's about referencing. So, for an example, so obviously Monday I was redoing my Chicago one. I've mentioned Shaw and Mackay in there. It's 1942. When in the in-text citation, am I citing the Newman book that I was reading it in, or am I citing them, referencing them?
If you're being super honest, you're citing the book you read it in, and I'll show you an example in a few slides' time,
Okay.
where you literally say cited in so-and-so's work.
Yeah.
Now,
And then in the reference list, I will put Newman
rather than them. Yeah.
And again, so I'm putting the page numbers in the in-text citation, but not in the reference.
Not in the reference list, no.
It's just the name of the book
And the author, date of publication, etc.
and area of publication,
Yeah.
isn't it? Area, is it?
Ideally,
Area first, isn't it? No.
you
Area first, then
area and then the name of the publisher.
yeah.
Not all books tell you where it was published, which is unfortunate.
No.
But if they don't, they don't.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
You just ignore it. You put in the name of the publisher.
Okay. So quite a short reference if it's
Yeah.
if it's a book like that, for example.
Yes.
Don't put the chapter.
You don't need to. Not in the reference list. No.
Wow.
What I don't know if it's recommended, but I don't know if you do as well. We use the citation thing that's built into Word.
Yes, that's the.
I haven't had any feedback since I've used it. That's wrong.
No, that is a good technique to use. Yes.
Yeah, he said, like, we got told by someone else not to use it, but I haven't.
No, that's fine.
Without it now, I can't remember how to do it.
If you so on top of Word, it says like home, blah blah blah. Yeah, references.
So,
Yeah,
and
I've
then
gone on to that.
insert citation,
Yeah.
add new source, and then wherever you found it, usually book, and then it just literally prompts you to put in all the things in there. So the title of the year, the city, the publisher,
Oh,
the edition,
fantastic.
and then you.
And then does it put it in the
So
same
what it does,
format? So can you put like Harvard and it'll
Yeah,
in
I don't know
that
if I've
format?
I've already selected that. So next to the citation thing,
Yeah.
it's got different, whatever it is, however you have to cite it.
Oh, wow.
But it's amazing. I don't know how.
No, only if it's a quotation. There's only page numbers where you're doing a quotation. If it's just an idea, you don't need to state which page it was from. So that's
At
fine.
the end, you.
Or if it's a graph or a chart, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. If you click. Oh.
It comes up straight away with the citation.
Bibliography. Or then if you click references, it will then, so when you're writing work, you can insert citation when you finish writing it, and it'll come up with like Bennett 2022.
Right.
At the end, you have to put reference list,
Hmm.
which is where you click here, bibliography, that's not what you want the references, you click that,
It just puts it
brings
in.
it up.
So
At the
as
end, the
you
whole
do
list comes
the
in.
I'll do it as you
in-text
go along.
citation, that's when you put all of
It
fill in
does-
those boxes
It does
and then
the
it just.
citation for you as well, yeah. But I do it when you go along.
It's just going.
Otherwise,
Well, yeah, because someone said that you can the computer you can put it in alphabetical order.
Yes.
And I couldn't even find
That
how to
will
do
put it in
So I
alphabetical
had
order for you.
moving things and putting things in, and then it's like, oh, that's a B, E, not B, after it's like U, and
As long as you put the reference in, list in at the end and you finish, it will be like an alphabetical order. Could you reference
thank you for that.
Yeah, I think you does double check it.
There's videos
as well on YouTube.
Indeed. And the library has lots of sources.
See,
Yeah, the
I
library
just
was
walk around with this, it's that tatty.
Yeah,
But
so
it's
yeah,
not
yeah.
got every example, so it's like, well, that one's an article, not a journal, or,
Yeah.
you know, of that question I asked, it tells you how to reference from a book, but not take a reference from a reference in a book.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Pleasure. Level 4, level 5, what the hope is is that your reading will start to incorporate a lot more journals and journal articles. So it doesn't mean you give up reading books, it just means you try to add in a few journals once you get to level 5, level 6. And you're expanding into different directions, because usually journal articles are more in-depth, specific, detailed, whereas a book is covering a wide array of subjects. A journal is tight and in-depth. So the hope is that you're going into more detail on your reading. Need to be a little bit cautious where you're using websites. Some websites are really good, find sources of information, but as we all know from the joys of the internet, there's an awful lot of crap out there in terms of really rubbish websites. So the hope is that if you're putting a website in, it's a decent website, an academic one ideally, not a rubbish website, unless you've been specifically told that you need to do a review of so-and-so website, in which case that's fine. But if it's just you doing general background reading, look for the academic university-run websites rather than joeblogs.com type things.
I pretty much just use journals and articles online.
Mm-hmm.
But would I get marked down if I'm not including books? Obviously, I know dissertation you've got to have good bibliography and stuff like that, but just for the next year or so.
No, that's fine. Journal articles is fine. When you do get to dissertation, then
Yeah.
have both. Yeah. In terms of the paraphrasing issue, this is a sizable stumbling block for a lot of people, in that a lot of students are not sure what they are, I say not what they're doing, but how to do it, more to the point. So let's say you have gone onto a website and you found that quote there on a website, the one on the left-hand column, about perceptions of police violence were disproportionate to actual recorded instances, blah, blah, blah. And you think, oh, I can use that for my assignment. And you think, how am I going to use this? So you do a cut and paste job, and the thing on the right-hand column is what you put into your essay or report or whatever type of thing it is that you're writing. So it's almost, you'll see the one on the right is almost word for word identical to the one on the left, with just a few extra words chucked in about Jackson found that. Now, a lot of people assume that's okay because they have put in Jackson's name. Unfortunately, that classes as plagiarism, because it is a direct cut and paste job from the original source. And certainly if somebody is, let's say an essay assignment, whatever it is 60, 70, 80% cut and paste jobs from some other source, it will be flagged as non-stop plagiarism. When you upload online, there's a program called Turnitin, which highlights in coloured sections where everything has come from. It says, oh, this has come from so-and-so website, this has come from some other website, and it goes through all of that. A little bit is you can kind of get away with, but if there's more of that than there is of you, that's going to get a failing grade and the request to rewrite. So whilst, yes, you have acknowledged that Jackson exists, that's not sufficient because the rest of it is just cut and paste. So what you would need to do to avoid any suggestion of plagiarism is something a lot more like this. So you've still got elements like the 215 Americans. A number is a number. There's not too many ways you can, if you want to cite a statistic, you kind of got to use the same numbers that the original person used. Oh dear, what's this doing? Oh no, that's back to not working. But you're trying to put this as much as possible in your own words, rather than just cutting and pasting what the original website said. So this whilst a few of the words are the same, because the majority is not, this is acceptable. And you're also saying where the information has come from, Jackson 2012, name and date, which are the key points. So this is ideally what you're aiming for.
What if you use work from your previous work?
You can't. Self-plagiarism, bizarrely, is a thing.
That's where I went.
Yeah.
Because I used something that I used before. Although I didn't fail because it was only a little bit.
Yeah.
I'd used one thing that when we were doing that meal group presentation. And I'd use something that we used in Access. and that flagged up as plagiarism.
Yes.
I don't understand that though, 'cause I don't understand why.
Well, the idea is you can reword it. Yes. Reword it. Yeah.
It was only like my note. It was only the notes for the presentation.
Yeah.
The things you were going to say. Yeah, it was in the notes, and that flagged up. That's what I was like, what? I mean, I still passed it, but it was because you had to have them in
Upload
with the
them.
presentation.
Oh, it was yours.
Yeah, and it was in the notes, and I'd.
They know it's from the previous one as well.
Because the previous one is still
The
online.
previous one,
Everything online ever.
yeah, it's there.
Yeah. I know it sounds bizarre that you can plagiarize yourself, but the idea is that there, without, not that you'd know who the names are anyway, even if I did name them, but without naming names, there have been students in the past who've basically resubmitted what is essentially a recycled assignment, where they've changed the first 3 words and the rest of it's the same.
I did consider it on victims of crime, and I was like, the victim section.
It was literally just like a section on. Actually, it was Zimbardo. The Zimbardo,
Yes.
that explaining the prison study.
Yeah.
That's quite basically what it was. And I thought,
Well-
well, I've explained it before. It's all and of course that was access, so I didn't think it would be.
Sadly, it all stays, once it's online, it's captured electronically
But now I
and
know,
stays
I
there.
realise.
So what they're looking for in terms of edit presentations, essays, whatever, is that this piece of work is original rather than a repetition of a previous piece of work. So even if the piece of work is on the same subject matter as something you've done previously, you need to come at it from a different angle and reword it.
It wasn't even like it was just the
Which
notes
is
that I was
why you will
talking
have
about.
passed.
Yeah.
So had it been an essay, that would be a different
Oh, yeah,
situation.
I would have been in an essay, like my guidance notes.
Yeah. So in terms of what constitutes paraphrasing, this is what constitutes paraphrasing. If you wanted to do a quotation, let's say you found some very pithy thing that Durkheim said once that you think, wow, that captures what I want to say. Perfect, but you put it in quotation marks. And say the book and the page number, it as well, you don't say the title of the book, but you say Durkheim 1902 or whatever year it was, that the book from which we're taking the quotation came. The Turnitin system recognizes quotation marks. It's a bit weird because if you do the single apostrophe at either end, it doesn't realize that's a quotation. And it goes, oh my God, plagiarism. Whereas if you do the two marks at either end, it realizes it's a quotation and doesn't include it as a thing to be concerned about.
You put in my assignment about not using too long a quote.
Yes, short and sweet.
Because I've got the one that says the rich, the rich, what's it, poor goes to prison, yeah.
Yeah, the rich get off.
So you're saying kind of like one sentence is
Yes. The thing to avoid is, let's say you've written a 1,500 word assignment and 500 words of it is quotation. Bit much. So short, sweet, and not very many of them is the idea with quotations. If it's getting massive, great long quotations that go on for half a page, or there's just like 3 dozen quotations here, there, and everywhere, that's too much. So like putting spice in food, a little goes a long way. Absolutely. And ideally do the double quotations just to stop the Turnitin system having kittens, and that avoids causing issues there. If you're not sure how to phrase something, so long as you aren't leaving it until 10 minutes before deadline, then you can always contact me, Louise, whoever it is, and ask, and we'll say, well, you need to jiggle it around a bit, or we'll say that's perfect, use it as it is. So it's just a case of making sure you're not, as has happened, to the point where there's 3 words at the beginning, 3 words at the end that belong to the student, and everything in the middle is cut, paste, cut, paste, cut, paste, cut, paste. That's not ideal, even if the names of the people from whom it is being cut and pasted are included. It's worse if they're not, because it's outright plagiarism if you don't say where it's come from, whereas this is more likely to be interpreted as mistaken sourcing and not seen as a deliberate attempt to pass somebody else's work off, which does happen. You know, we've had students who've, in one case, the whole thing was written by a different student who'd uploaded it 2 years earlier, and then it reappeared under somebody else's name 2 years later. You can, yeah.
Yeah, we got an email after.
S.A. Mills.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know
On
that.
who would do that last year?
A lot of people.
Someone with a large student debt to repay.
The thing is that you have to do it from the beginning, because otherwise you're going to notice a change in styles.
Yes.
You either do all of them
Yeah.
and hope that that person you're paying doesn't stop.
Well, it does occasionally happen where you think, well, this reads almost like it was another person entirely.
You don't think that about mine.
Yeah, but then if it's different subjects, like if you read an assignment of mine on memory in psychology, then and compared to something in criminology, it would be very different.
Yeah.
I hate memory in psychology.
Ideally, but
Do you get thrown off the course?
not normally for the first time, but you do get a very strongly worded letter saying, "Don't do this again."
Then, isn't it, if you get caught, you get black.
Yeah.
Yeah, black.
Really?
I think you can back this from.
So yes, so the aim is don't cut and paste, basically, is what it boils down to. There are going to be times when, let's say you're talking about statistics and you found a book or a journal full of data and numbers, and there's only so many ways you can talk about statistics. You know, there's not that much you can jiggle the words around. The numbers are basically going to be the same. We do understand that if you're using numbers from a source, yes, it will flag up on Turnitin, but we appreciate that a number is a number. What can you do about that? It's the wording that's the issue, how you use language, so it's not just a straight paste job from somewhere else. The only time you should ever be pasting is if you are doing a quotation and you don't fancy writing the quotation out by hand, you just want to paste the quotation, but you present it as a quotation, where you would be saying, oh, Durkheim said, blah, 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 in quotation marks, and then giving the page number. So it's very obvious. This is a quotation. You're not pretending it's anything else. It's his words.
Quotations campaign.
If it depends how you do them. If you paste them into a text box, then they don't register as the word count. Whereas if you put them into the actual sentence, they do register as the word count. Yeah. Which is a good way of avoiding eating up your word count in a dissertation. Yeah.
The words.
Quotations in text box.
Yes, particularly if your word count is close to the edge and you want to say something and you're running out of word count, then putting quotations in or tables of data numbers into a text box will stop it registering on the word count.
It's almost like a figure.
Yeah.
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 Gotcha.
Oh, that's acceptable.
Yeah.
Just a general assignment.
Yes.
That's cool. Just a random box. I just don't. I don't know. I feel like I've been told off.
No, it's perfectly fine to put in an inserted text box, so you've got the quotation
Drop
appearing.
the text box down from put it in and
Just
just.
have it spanning across the width of the page.
Or well, normally you have it kind of the paragraph ends,
Yeah.
text box, next paragraph begins. So it's between paragraphs.
So it's like you've written something I don't know about people. I don't know, anything, but then you just want to finally summarise it, but don't want to waste your words into really great.
Yeah.
Text box.
Yeah.
Perfect. That's a really good idea.
What we're looking for from level 4 onwards is for you to develop your own voice. Now, some people already have their own voice, they don't need to develop it, that's fine. Other people are a bit shy, a bit more timid, and are still trying to find their own feet academically. And so it becomes a process of learning to say what you want to say. Now, the challenge, of course, in, well, almost all subjects, but particularly in the social sciences, is that you have to back up your points with somebody else's research. So you can't just say, I think that, blah, 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 blah. You're saying Marx suggests that, Durkheim finds that, Freud discovered that. So you're always referring to somebody else, and that can feel, for a lot of people, as if they're not expressing their own point of view, because they're constantly having to talk about somebody else's research. What you're trying to do is look at an issue, think about it, read round it, and think, right, this is what I think's going on. Now, can I find anyone who's done some research that backs up what I think? So when you're citing Freud or Durkheim or whoever the hell it is you're citing them because they agree with the point you want to make. So it's, even though it's not you writing, I think that, nonetheless, this is what you think.
When I first enrolled in Ipswich, the exact psychology and criminology, the said, first year is we want to know that you know where to find it. Second year is we want to start hearing your voice. Third year we want your ideas.
Yeah.
Is that kind of a really loose way of?
Yes. Ideally, by second semester of your first year, you should be starting to find your feet. So first semester is just who the hell are these people? What did they say, etc. And towards the end of the second semester, you hopefully getting to the point of thinking, I agree with this one, but I think that one is talking out the back of their head. And you're developing a sense of critiquing what you're looking at rather than just believing everything you read, because clearly half of what you're reading is contradicting each other anyway. Yeah. So it's a case of thinking, well, where does the evidence that lay? Where does it reside? Does the evidence support this person, that person, or that person? And so that's what we're looking for, is you moving from just saying Freud said this, Marx said that, towards getting to a point of saying, well, where's the evidence to prove that Freud is right, or Marx is right, or Durkheim's right, or Skinner's right, or whoever is right? So you're starting to delve, and as you get into the second year, being more confident at doing that, at saying, well, yeah, they said it, but the evidence suggests such and such. And that's where you're finding your interest. So by the time you get to third year and your dissertation, you are confident to speak in your own voice, but to back up your opinions with evidence. Because the trouble with a lot of these subjects, sociology, psychology, criminology, etc., is it's trying to avoid the old joke about everyone having an opinion. But everyone does have an opinion on all sorts of subjects, and an opinion is worth hot air. What we need is evidence.
So even though it's what you think, you still. So how do you evidence what your own?
You look at the research. Has anyone done any research that supports the conclusion that you're coming to?
Right.
So let's say, for example, you think that domestic violence affects women more than men. Okay. Point of view could be lived experience, could be all sorts of things you have for that, but that's your point of view. How do you prove that? Well, you could look at statistics, crimes reported to the police, etc.
That's what I'm thinking. I mean, you might have a life experience and an absolute, more than just once life experience, but can't find most, academics.
Yes, haven't looked into it yet.
Haven't got a clue.
Yeah.
Of the reality of it.
Well, that could be dissertation.
That sounds like a serious reason. We had one this morning.
Yep. If there's no research, there's a window to create some.
Is it quite common as well that first semester degree, it's most people or a lot of people do struggle with have to resubmit an assignment? Is that quite normal?
Yep, not uncommon at all.
Honestly, it's just destroyed my confidence, and I was so confused because I didn't have anything returned in Ipswich. I just couldn't figure it out, but
We have got
Then
quite
when I read it
rigorous
back,
markers.
it was, yeah, I can see.
I have to say.
That's quite normal.
Yes, quite
I
standard.
noticed a big, even at Access, I noticed a big difference in the level of marking with certain tutors.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have our favourite.
The quality of the markers
Yeah, you're
that we have now.
Yeah.
I mean,
Does that
you
make a
are,
difference when it comes to dissertation?
you are
Your
a lot
marks
more
that are
rigorous.
psychology or sociology?
Partly, well, your supervisor is your first marker. Depends what subject you're looking at.
Okay, so if I want you to mark it, would it be sociology?
Not automatically.
Oh, okay.
It's usually if, let's say, you're doing something on a subject, a particular lecturer knows a lot about that subject.
Yeah, how do we know if it's going to mark our dissertation? Like,
Well,
subject?
it's the subject and things like staff hours. So.
But I'm not joking. No, we've actually been talking about it out there. What's your favourite subject?
We will cover some of those issues at the end of the year in terms of dissertation tutorials.
In Nottingham, and she's at exactly the same point we started at the same time. She's not had to submit anything yet at all. They've done like a few brief presentations.
That's a little worrying.
But then if you think, she will then feel a bit overwhelmed because her submission dates are probably a lot closer together.
Yeah, she's loving life at the minute. She's got a few assignments due like now in the second semester. She's about to start, they've just started being given them.
Right.
In the first semester, then
That's odd.
just a few presentations and one like
Going to be a bit of a culture shock when it all arrives. Yeah.
How are you? I'm doing whatever you're doing. I'm like drowning in psychobiology.
So the idea is, by your reading around, you explore lots of angles of issues, you develop your ideas, you look at the research, you learn how to distinguish between good research and bad research, and start to evaluate what you're looking at. Develop that into the second year. By third year, you should be sufficiently confident. You can look at a bit of research and think, yes, this is really good, or no, this is really bad, and know the reasons why it's good or the reasons why it's bad, and weigh it up accordingly. So that's ultimately what we're looking for, is you to find that confidence, because your dissertation is, well, I say it should be, ideally, something you are passionate about, rather than something that you just think, oh, that will do. Then you're lumbered with writing umpty thousand words about something that bores you to death. So it should be up to 10,000 words. It does. 6 to 10,000. 3,000 for access.
I thought 6,000 with you. 5 years ago.
It's 3,000 now.
And if you put in a 6,000 word dissertation, are you like on the lower end of the mark?
No,
You get like really
the grade isn't to do with the number word count. It's quality, and the word count is determined by the kind of research you're doing. So if you were to do a psychological experiment, that would be 6,000, because that has to be written very tightly, an experimental report. Whereas if you're doing lots of interviews, you'd be more 9,000-10,000, because you've got to go into thematic analysis, which is a wordier thing to do in the first place.
That doesn't sound like too much of a daunting number, though. I thought you were going to say.
It soon goes. You will just about everybody I've ever taught at third year, their single complaint with dissertation is how much they have to cut out.
Yeah.
Not padding, it's cutting it out.
The premise I started it and I was like, oh my god, got to near the end and I was like, I haven't got enough words. I've never got to that stage where I don't have enough.
Yeah, you can have it. That's probably what I do all the time. Well, we can't pick one.
I can't quite make the word count. I must
me
be.
too.
So does your dissertation have to be like a form of research? You have to do a form of research. It can't
Yes.
just be like a literature.
Well, you can do secondary research,
Yeah.
but it's still research.
what's in terms of, so you can just look at other people's research?
You do a meta-analysis. Essentially, you're writing a meta-analysis, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do. People sometimes think that's the easy option, and it's not.
So another question regarding this. The library lady.
Yeah.
Librarian. Sorry. She said about using a site called Grammarly.
Yes.
My dad has done an open university. He mentioned it to me. Because I find myself feeling like I'm constantly saying so and so suggests, so and so argues, and there's how many different
a thesaurus. Yeah.
Is that? I mean, I'm going to repeat myself.
To a point, yes.
So many words I can.
Some people do have verbal tics, where they have a tendency to use certain words or phrases constantly. So almost every sentence begins in the same way, which gets a bit repetitive, and it's variation is fine.
Very it's almost like, is there anything you can recommend as an alternative?
So if you like right click, say suggests, if you right click again and go on to synonyms, it gives you like an alternative like word for it.
It's an inbuilt thesaurus.
Yeah, synonyms. Topic, expression, matter. Something keeps saying, like say subject. I don't know what word.
Well, say suggest.
Yes.
So you were talking about
So
quality of
Yeah,
research
things like
that
implied,
you're
yeah,
referencing.
yeah,
And I know you had bang on about peer-reviewed journals, but how do you find out if it's peer-reviewed?
If you go onto Google Scholar, Google Scholar will tell you how many peer reviews have taken place for a given journal article. So if it's 0, no one's reviewed it yet. It could be a dozen, 30, 40, 3, whatever number.
Just on the Scholar.
Yeah.
Before you click on it.
Yeah.
When you get a intelligence library, at the side, say side, it'll give you like dates. It also gives you a peer review. I think
Yeah.
consider that.
This library plus.
How do you know, like,
No, just on if you go into the library.
Marcus Rushford or someone has a peer reviewed, how does it, what quantifies the peer reviews?
Peer review means it's been reviewed by other academics rather than by some random footballer.
But how do they, what I'm saying is how, who puts it on Google Scholar that's such a review?
The Google system itself, every time an academic writes a review of something, it's registered centrally.
And they're like registered, so they're
Yes.
registration.
Yes. So it's not the case that any old Muppet has reviewed it. It's a case
Like
that
Johnny Vegas.
yes. So you have to be an academic with a university to conduct an official review.
Yeah, that's what I wondered how.
Yep.
What quantifies a scholar review?
Theory and
As mentioned earlier about quotations, less is more. So just use very few quotations, scatter them through. The same can be said of things like charts and graphs, drowning a subject matter in graph after graph after graph after graph for things like reports. It's only really useful if you're explaining what those graphs mean. So if you just go, oh, look, 50 graphs, woo! Yes, ultimately. If you explain the graph or chart or whatever it may be, it shows you understand the numbers. You're not just chucking in numbers because it looks good. It shows you understand it, and that's what gets you the grade.
Is that like my, I don't know if you remember you work on the time of legislation, but is that like my Elliot Curry presentation at the start of last semester where I had one on graph and
Yeah, the fact that you explained it.
the rise in crime and
Yes, and you explained the graph, so that's why you got a good grade for that one.
what grade did I get?
You somewhere in the 70s for that.
What?
Mhm.
Seriously?
Yeah.
I never got my grade back. I only got one page back.
Oh right, did I thought Barry put the grades on the.
No,
Okay,
they're
no,
not.
okay.
They're not the sweet, as if I got first. What? My first quotation, I didn't know. What was that? Which one was that? You had it curry one.
Oh, it was good.
Trim one. When we did our trim presentation with Bazza.
Oh, I don't think I was there on that day.
Oh, it was good. Yeah, Kerry was good. I don't know.
In terms of citations, there's various different ways of laying them out. All of these are acceptable ways of laying out citations in the body of your writing. Doesn't matter if it's an essay or a report or whatever, the same principle applies. So to give you examples of each, if it's a single person, like the one on the left-hand side with Eccleston, the name, date in brackets, just the date of the book. A lot of people, for reasons I'm not quite sure why, have a tendency to put birth and death dates in, and that maybe in a history assignment or something that would be fine, but for psychology, sociology, criminology, I don't need to know when someone was born or when they died. I just need to know the year they wrote their book that you're drawing from. So Eccleston, 2018, found out studying classical music improved retention, blah, blah, blah. That would be the key point of his findings. You're referencing him and giving the date. That's fine. The second example there, you're talking about mindfulness in more general terms, and Tennant would be an example of someone who has written about mindfulness, with not that you are citing something very specific that he said as per the first person, you're just, here's an example of someone who talks about it. So Tennant 2020, and both the whole thing in brackets.
As they were saying earlier about having like someone's name who says something like that Eccleston one,
yeah.
If that's something we just know or
you found him in your reading round and your research.
What if I just found him in a lecture? And I put him into a thing that if you've said something and then
that would be fine, as long as on your reference list you don't put
so
me.
Eccleston 2018.
And then find, yeah.
I don't have to put anything in my reference list.
You do. Every name you put has to appear in your reference list.
Find it in a book.
Yes. So you could ask me where it came from, or you could just Google his name and go, oh, there's one of his books. Okay. Put that one on.
Okay. But that is what I've been doing. I wasn't sure if you could just put the name in from knowledge from your brain.
Not per se. There's some, so even if you've heard it in a lecture or you've been listening to a TED talk or something, you would need to track down a source. Now you can cite a TED talk if the person you want to cite is the person giving the talk. Okay. If they've just mentioned somebody else during their talk, you would need to track that person down to a book or a journal article or some written document of another that you can cite to. The one there where you got Smith and later Capaldi, so you're looking at two people doing two separate bits of research around a similar sort of a subject. You could put a whole list of names, but if you had like 20 names, it would get a bit monotonous after a while. So 2-3 names is quite sufficient of several people who have looked at the same basic issue and gone over it accordingly. And in a similar format to the Eccleston one, it's the surname followed by the date of publication. Don't need to know their first name. Just their surname and so on. Normally, the only time you'd mention somebody's first name is if you've got two people with the same surname and you want to distinguish one from the other.
Then it's just the initial, isn't it?
You could put the initial, or you can put or if they're really awkward and they're both called F. Jones, then you put Fred and Frank Jones or whatever.
Okay, so if you're doing it as initial, don't you do, let's say we're talking about the Baker one, and their first name was Andrew. It will be Baker A.
Yes.
19,
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Just when you're writing, you would put Andrew Baker did this.
No, you just put Baker did this. So you don't have to. So unless specifically you want to distinguish Andrew Baker from Maureen Baker, and then you would need to say the name so we'd be aware, the reader would be aware these are two different Bakers, not the same Baker.
In that scenario, you'd put Baker A did this, or Andrew Baker.
Well, you could put either Andrew Baker or Baker A.
But other than that, just never put their first name.
Yeah, just if you're only talking about one person called Baker, just put Baker.
Yeah, because when I was reading about the Milgram, he's always called Stanley Milgram. It's never just Milgram.
Oh,
Oh, really?
so with the Baker and Hart now, is that when two people are working on a research project together?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So the Smith-Capaldi one, they're not working together.
No, they're separate.
Separate, yeah.
I'm just making sure.
But Baker and Hartnell, the implication there is because it's Baker and Hartnell that they were working together at the same time on that same 1999 bit of research there. So if you've got the situation where there's, let's say, Baker and Hartnell and Jones and Smith and 3 other people, you normally put et al. So McCoy et al.
Just about to ask that, what's the maximum number of names before you then start putting it as
Usually 3 at a push. But a lot of people, if there's more than 2 people involved, will just put the first name, possibly the second person, and then et al. To indicate this, because as you will notice, some of these journals, you've got 5, 6, 7 names attached to the journal. So you don't have to put every single person. You just put the first one. The first one, when you're reading it, the name that very first appears is the lead, the person in charge of the team. So they don't put them in alphabetical order. They put the boss first, and then everybody else comes after.
Talking about, say, generalising theory, with the Smith and Angela. If I'm just generalising theory, and then after it I went to I've got 3 or 4 people that sort of research that theory. I wouldn't need to do it like that, would I? I can just put one bracket and then put them all in the same bracket, but with a apostrophe between them.
Yes, comma. Yeah, absolutely.
With just that between them, I wouldn't need to go through like 4.
No. So to answer your question about the no, it's your question. Sorry, wasn't it? Green's question about the name you read in a book.
yeah, I saw that.
The Davison format is the one you do. So you say Davison cited in McGann, and in your reference list you'd have McGann's book.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have Davison's name wouldn't need to appear in your reference list, only McGann, because it's McGann's book you got the name of Davison from.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. That was one I was a bit unsure about.
So this is when it says in text, in other words, the citations you include as you're writing. The way you reference them, as per that photocopy you got there, with 50 different varieties of referencing. If it's a TV show, if it's a newspaper, if it's a book, if it's this, if it's that, if it's the other, there are variations on that, and that's the topic that the librarians are happy to come in and talk to you about and go over every variation you might potentially need, if you would find that useful to have them come in and bombard you with information about layout.
So just very quickly, before you move on, you said about at the beginning about where we get our information from, sources from, and not ideally not to use the textbook that we're using. I'm a bit confused about that. I mean, certainly for the first semester.
Introductory books are fine in your first year.
Well,
in your second year, the aim is to move on to something a bit more involved.
Yeah, no, I get that, but it was just thought, wow, that's kind of quite harsh for, you know, the first year, first semester, and we've been given a reading list that's cost us a bloody fortune, and then you run into it. It's like.
You can certainly use them, but don't cite to them. So is everyone happy with the difference between a reference list and a bibliography? So you could have your introductory text in your bibliography, but not in your reference list in the second year.
Right, but I can use it
in the first year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. In terms of what to avoid, they already mentioned a bit about birth dates and death dates for Freud, 1856 to 1939. Don't need to know that. So that there's no gain or benefit to putting birth and death dates in. So what I would be looking for is either the date of one of his own books, or if you've read about Freud in somebody else's book, then a cited in Smith's book from such and such a year. The second one about Carl Jung wrote a book in the 1960s. Yes, he did. Wrote several books in the 1960s. So that would be, whilst it is technically correct, he did indeed write a book in the 60s. That's not really a proper in-text citation, because what's needed is the actual year, not a vague decade. So it's just about being specific rather than just kind of a random, sometime in the 30s this happened, sometime in the 20th century that happened. Needs something a bit more tighter, a bit more specific. So what we are starting to look for in the second year, and most certainly in the third year, is analysis. The more analysis, the better. That's what gets you the better grades. Analysis is where you move from describing what somebody thinks about something to looking for evidence as to whether they're correct to be thinking what they think. So that fundamentally is what analysis boils down to, provision of evidence. Freud said this, Jung said that, Karl Marx said something else. That's all nice and good. What evidence is there that they are correct? Or indeed evidence that they're wrong in saying what they're saying? So that's where you start to delve into more specific evidence to try and find information. And it doesn't matter if you're finding information for them or against them, as long as you're finding information that says something about the quality of their theories. That can include quality of their work. Now, with both sociology, psychology, and criminology, some of it is given over to looking at reports and research and experiments and that sort of thing, and talking about issues like ecological validity, how statistics are compiled, sampling sizes, all of that sort of stuff. So how did they actually do their research? So in Karl Marx's case, he sat in a chair, puffed a cigar, and wrote stuff. That was his research. Engels at least traipsed around a few factories and interviewed a few people, got off his arse and did something more useful. You might, let's say you're looking at a psychology report, for argument's sake, and you know that they conducted some research with 50 people in a room. That tells you, 50 people, that's a fairly reasonable number. And then you look at another bit of research by somebody else, and they did their research with 8 people. So the one with 50 people, that suggests bigger number of people. This is more applicable to the real world than just 8 people. That doesn't mean the 8 people research is absolute rubbish, but to go from 8 people to saying this applies to the entire human race is a bit of a leap.
So basically look for the better quality studies.
Absolutely, yes. So have they had a big sample size? Has there been retesting? Somebody else has maybe tried the same research in a different country or a different decade to see, is this something that only applies to teenage students in America, which is about 95% of the research is teenage students in America, or is this something that would apply to middle-aged people in Sweden or elderly people in China or whatever? Is this just peculiar to one group of people? What they've found.
Why you asked me about the Japan people on the presentation? Hey, pennies just dropped.
Certainly, if that research has been done in different countries and found similar results, that again suggests that this is applicable to a bigger picture. If it's only ever been done with American students or whatever, then yes, it may be true of that type of person. Doesn't mean it's true of very different types of people in other parts of the world, or only been done with lads, does it apply to women? Vice versa. So it's looking for evidence that this isn't just somebody sitting in an armchair, puffing a cigar and making stuff up as they go along. This is something that's been put to the test. Someone has made an effort to find evidence to support it. It might be, and this would get you quite a good grade, if you can think to yourself, well, what would prove this to be true? Right. If this person's theories are right, I would expect to see such and such a thing in the world. Can you see such and such a thing in the world? And if the answer is yes, you can refer to that. If the answer is no, that doesn't appear to happen, you can refer to the fact that it doesn't happen. If Joe Bloggs' theory is right, why isn't this happening? that might suggest that Joe Bloggs' theory is a bit limited in some capacity. So you'd be looking for supportive evidence. The bit about timelessness, often a criticism raised of Freud that in the world he lived in, late Victorian Edwardian times, for the upper classes, maybe they did have odd relationships with their mothers and all sorts of weird things happened. Is that still the case 100 years later? Is it still the case for people in working class homes, in upper class homes, in very different types of homes? Or is what he is describing really only a reflection of a very particular time in history when people lived like that? So some theories you might look at and think, yeah, that's going to be true for the next 1,000 years. Other theories you look at and think, it was true then.
So what if you, so let's say you've got a theory from a kind of, and they had the evidence, well, for that point back then, but then obviously they've tried to expand the theories and
Yep.
as the theories have expanded, because my issue is that I waffle on, and obviously that doesn't work for research reports because obviously it has to be very concise, and
Yep.
my brain goes a bit further, but then doesn't like to can't tie things up. So I've started a new method and I'm doing it now. I lost where I originally started at. No, it's gone.
You waffle.
I waffle.
You tried the weed, not generally weed, but the structure that you
Yes.
use those sometimes, because I'm a bit like that, I can't go down the rabbit hole.
Why evidence?
Yeah, that type of thing.
I need to look at that.
Or something.
What I've started doing is just every time I write something, I put in red capital letters why. Why have you written that? Like, why is it there? And then if I leave it there, sometimes I'll be like, okay, like, why have I put it? Okay, that makes sense. And it did actually help me with my chronology one. But I've forgotten what I was actually going to ask in the first place. So let's move on.
Contemporary research is much valued. Now, if let's say you are looking at Freud, obviously we're going back to the 1800s. He said what he said. Can you find anyone who has, let's say, sometime in the last 20 years, looked at Freud's ideas and tried to update them or tried to do some research that applies them? So whilst you can introduce Freud's ideas from the 1800s, if you can then say, however, in 2010, Joe Bloggs did so-and-so research into Freud's ideas, that brings it into a contemporary setting. To say you're not just looking at a very old idea, you're looking at something that people are trying to research and study and look at in the current period. So something within the last 10 years, 15 years, that you can bring an old theory up to date with is ideal. And that will give you a few extra grade points.
I'm doing the general one, obviously, a lot of so
yeah.
Although there's a lot of kind of like up and wild and all that kind of, there are contemporary sort of
yes
writers sort of now, but it's difficult to introduce those things without
the classical ones first. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What you could do potentially, depending on quite which angle you're going down, is if let's say you're looking at somebody like Oakley talking about the gender pay gap in 1970, if you could then bring in someone from 5 years ago who says, what's the evidence for the gender pay gap now?
Yeah.
So you say what this idea was raised in 1970. The current research is that it's better, worse, whatever. This is how it is now.
Yeah.
So you kind of have the classical, but you bring in, yeah.
Because I need to put a bit of classical in there.
It's still a very interesting approach, though, despite how bonkers it is very, very fascinating.
Yeah.
Enjoying it.
I came in here, I spent 4 hours reading Judy Butler.
Oh, Lord. Your brain must be bleeding by now.
It really is. Yeah.
There's a
Absolutely.
reason we should talk about them, isn't there?
Yep, yes. They set the agenda for the modern understanding. Absolutely. I think the slight difficulty there is you do get some modern day feminist writers who still seem to think it's 1970 when they're writing, and they don't seem to have twigged that the world has moved on a bit since 1970, but there we are. So bringing in modern sources is always a useful move to make, and looking at the critique of how this theory works. Is it consistent? Is it a contradictory theory? Has anyone spoken in praise of it or written it off as ridiculous? Are there other points of view about that theory that you can bring in? Because that again will edge your grade up if you can bring in some critique. Critique can be flattering. I mean, we tend to think of critique as slagging somebody off. It isn't necessarily. It could be saying they're amazing and wonderful, but here's 5 reasons why they're amazing and wonderful, or 5 reasons why they're completely lunatic. And
I find that much easier if I'm talking about a subject I'm not kind of sat
on the fence about it.
Yeah, especially feminism, kind of right then. I find it much easier to be critical for every sort of thing I can find something.
Yeah.
So I find it much easier to do.
It's not easy to critique something you're quite passionate about.
Yeah, I always tend to be, that's when I tend to go down the rabbit hole and I really.
So, as an example, let's say you were writing something about Foucault and his ideas around observation and surveillance, where he suggests that if we know we are being watched by the authorities, we're more likely to be well behaved and not get up to naughty shenanigans. Foucault is a little bit like Marx. He spent a lot of time sitting in armchairs, puffing cigars, didn't do necessarily an awful lot of hardline hands-on research. A lot of theorizing and waffling, not so much backing it up with actual research. He did. Effectively, yes. If the boss is watching you, you work harder.
So how do you find, I mean, I'm struggling to find like the evidence on the point you made on for the classical one about the poor going to prison more often than the rich, and I don't know where to find that information. So
you could look.
Do we narrow things down?
So you could look to the Home Office in this country, which maintains statistics on prison convictions.
Yeah, but how would that evidence whether they were rich or poor?
What if you put into the search engine on the Home Office site conviction rates by social class.
Right, so legal aid in effect.
Yes.
Would that be a way?
That would be a significant fact that people likely to apply for legal aid are going to be economically lower down.
So that was just I can't think of another example.
Yeah.
Do we ask you
if you're stuck? Yes.
Yep. You can give us that information.
Yep. So it's a case of thinking, where could you find information? So potentially something like this, you could think, well, he was dead in 1985. These days we have CCTV cameras. Don't think they had them in 1985. I might be wrong. I'm not sure when they were first introduced, but no. So could you find some research into whether crime rates drop in areas with CCTV cameras compared to areas with no CCTV cameras? Stealing the cameras. So if you could find that evidence, then that would suggest maybe he's right. If we know we're being watched because we can see the cameras, we're more likely to behave ourselves. Conversely, if you look at the evidence and it doesn't make a blind bit of difference whether there's a camera there or not, it's the same crime rate, that would suggest he's wrong.
Always look at workers' studies as well, can't you? There's a lot of studies on employment, employees being watched by them.
Absolutely. Yep. Honesty at work.
As opposed to when they're
hardworking.
leave the room and
Revert to form. That there's research done with parents and children, how kids behave when mum and dad are there compared to how they behave when they're out in the room. So you could look at different forms of research to suggest, do people change their behaviour when they're being watched by someone with a degree of control over them? And well, the answer is normally yes. Yes, they do. So that would be something to back that up as you're looking into that. It wouldn't matter if the research, well, he himself, Foucault, didn't do that type of research, but let's say for argument's sake he did. You could refer to his research, or equally you could refer to research done by somebody else entirely that would either support or critique him.
It would be better to go to someone else entirely.
It does, especially if the person you're looking at is more recent than 1985.
See, I got marked down because I wasn't bringing in enough old people. Not old people. Traditional people. So I kept getting marked down. So now I've got to not only get new people in there, well, I've got to get old people in there and new people and still new.
Depends on the requirement of the question, where you're answering an essay question. If the essay question is specifically about classical theory, then you would be writing mainly about people from decades ago. If it's a more general question, so let's say a question about crime rates, you certainly could mention older theories up with current contemporary crime figures.
See, that's what I did for my presentation. I had a presentation in psych, and I based, well, to be fair, I had based a lot of it on the social and development, and I based it on social conformity, you know, and I've done like Ash, Milgram, and Sherry, and then I done more recent studies, but apparently I didn't show enough new studies. I've done like really recent ones, so I got marked down for that. So
It's difficult to find the balance.
Yep.
Might have been the way I presented it though, because I've spent a lot of time talking about Ash and Milgram, and then like maybe short on the other one, but no.
Yeah, could be a time ratio issue.
Yeah, maybe. Never know.
Okay. Least of all themselves. Tempting as it is to chuck in lots of humour, if you're doing a journal review or something like that, you can have the occasional humorous aside, and that's fine. If you're writing an essay or a lab report, never put humour in a lab report, goes down like a lead balloon. Try and keep it straight-laced and serious, and terribly, and down the line. So humour, things like journals and blogs and that sort of stuff is okay.
I'm currently writing something, my reflection thing, my blog post. I'm not going to say that I've been funny, but am I allowed to be a little bit funny in that?
If it's a blog post, yes.
It's not the blog post, it's a reflection bit.
The reflection, yes, you can be. You can chuck in a bit of humour. Ultimately, you could be all radical and reflect on the idea that a university education is trying to convert everybody into some middle-class cultured who talks in a certain way, and it's pushing a certain level of language, of academic language, which is quite a middle-class level of language. We might get all a bit power to the people and want to challenge that, but that's just the way it is. You know, that's what's being looked for within the context of writing an essay or an assignment. How you talk in real life is totally different, but how you write has got to meet a certain. Absolutely.
What does that word say? Avoid using it.
Colloquialisms. We'll get onto that in a second. Elision is where you drop letters like didn't and don't and can't and shan't and.
Like the way I speak.
If you've got someone who is friendly and willing to help proofreading, you kind of write it, get it done, show it to them, and they can go, change that, and then they can pick up on things like the can'ts and shan'ts and wouldn'ts and shouldn'ts and all of that. which will also, of course, bump up your word count a teeny little bit. Should not versus shouldn't.
When you do that, if you get someone to print, can you just get anyone to print it? Say you get a friend to print it, and you send it to them.
Mhm.
When you then send it to submit it,
Yeah.
will anything flag up as plagiarism?
It shouldn't do. No.
That's fine.
If they've given you some advice, and if they have emailed your response back to you with inset comments,
Yeah.
then obviously you need to remove the inset comments before
Yeah.
you upload.
No, it just meant once you like send it to someone, is it kind of out there? Does it?
No, as if it's just by email, turn it in, has no idea
That's fine then.
of email content.
Generally, it will know if it's plate, and I kind of thought, if I send it to someone to proofread,
Mm,
then
because
gonna
they're
flag
now
up
kind of
that
out there
it's-
in the
Yeah.
catalogue kind of thing.
I don't understand technology.
No, so emails are completely private when it comes to Turnitin. Colloquialisms are slang ways of talking. Ordinary things that are perfectly understandable, but nonetheless are considered slang ways of talking. And so the idea is to only talk in a terribly posh and plummy way, again, as if you were Stephen Fry writing and you're trying to make it sound upmarket, rather than saying, right lot of rubbish, nits. We know what you mean, clearly, but you will get a better mark for the second sentence than for the first sentence, even though they're basically saying much the same thing.
Can't say
Might be able to get away without that.
Even if it's true. If you're not sure whether something counts as a colloquialism or not, ask. And I can tell you, or Louise, or whoever it is you're asking can tell you whether you need to rephrase it or whether it's perfectly acceptable in the way you've already got it. So we can advise accordingly. As an example of a passage, this one with Galton and Rouge in 1965. Any problems that anyone can spot of why this would not be an ideal high-scoring section of work?
Well, it's reference from
It's not the ideal way of referencing. So the 1965 should be in brackets after the name, rather than where it is in the sentence. Any? It's a huge list. That's the central problem. That's a long, boring list to include there. It would be better to say something like, there were 12 items on the list, and then talk about one of them, two of them in a bit more depth, rather than just give a big long list of 12 things and the reader's left thinking, so what? So saying there's 12, perfectly fine. You don't need to list all 12. What would be more useful is if the person who wrote this had chosen one of them or maybe two of them and explained it in a bit more depth to say what these things actually mean, rather than just giving the list. That would be a more productive use of word count. Any other?
Can I steal some of that information for our cumulative on Thursday?
Potentially.
Use common sense. So like in developmental psychology, Phelps' core theory, her 5 things.
Yeah.
I listed all 5 things because it was her 5 things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If you say there are 5 key stages to Spelk's theory, one of them is blah blah blah, and then explain it. That's.
I didn't do like.
Don't leave any of your bags, Daddy. My.
That's to a sentence, yeah.
But it was like.
I listed all 5, but only elaborated on
Okay.
the first one, I think. that's okay as well.
Yeah, giving an elaboration and explanation is really what we're looking for. That it's not just a list, it's something you are showing you understand what those, or at least what one of them is.
Would that be okay because it's theory was
Yes. Yeah.
Thing it wasn't like it was relevant.
Relevant, yeah.
Yeah.
But the explanation of one or two of them would kind of gain the greater grade than just
a small list.
yes. Some of the language there could benefit from changing, like banged out and things like that is a bit of a colloquialism. So it could be polished up. It's not wrong what's being said on that slide. Technically, everything there is correct. It's just it would get a higher grade if it was polished up a bit and rephrased. Absolutely. So it lends itself to a bit of a polish, fundamentally. You've got the library staff will help with your referencing. So if you find yourself getting stuck with referencing, you can go to a library and go, and they will assist you and advise you. Again, try to do it with a bit of time rather than 3 minutes before you're meant to hand it in. Then you're more likely to get some assistance from them. And the academic skills team can help with spelling, grammar, those sorts of issues to pick up on, and proofreading through things for you. They're not subject specialists. They don't know the ins and outs of criminology and psychology and so forth. So if you got a theory wrong, they wouldn't necessarily know that you got it wrong, but they can advise you on spelling and grammar and layout and those sorts of an issue. That's where they come into it. Is everyone happy with third person and first person and second person? Bored to death hearing about that by now. Very rarely are you allowed to write in the first person. Normally, if it's a journal, you can because it's your personal reflection, but virtually everything else has got to be in the third person. It is found that, etc. Very easy if you're writing in a rush to forget that and slip into first person. So a benefit of having a proofreader is that they can say, oh, you said this there, you need to change that a bit to something else. Just pick up on those issues. Just briefly, when it comes to presentations, say if you would like a more in-depth session on how to do presentations and get good grades on them, we can organise something on that front. But just briefly, some key points that people often lose a few grade points on when they're doing presentations is timing is a bit of an issue. So if you're told to do a 15-minute, 10-minute, however many minute presentation, if you can get it as close to that as possible, so it's not half the length or double the length, but as close to the length as possible, which you can do if you've got a nice friendly person who's willing to sit and listen to you and time you and say, yeah, brilliant. Or no, you're 5 minutes short, you need an extra bit of waffle in there.
It's all right in theory, isn't it? But I tend to think once you get to the sandwich, you just don't like presenting. There's not really an awful lot.
And even if I record it at home myself, when I come to doing it, I speak 10 times the speed.
Yeah.
Nerves kick in. Yes. Becomes a bit of an issue.
For 6 years. No. But I used to do presentations for architects, like CPDs, and then my grade and feedback for the presentation in psychology was harsh. And I'm thinking something. I did that for work.
Robin, if I send you an email now, is it going to come up there?
No. Reading from a script is okay, but if you can get to the point where you're confident enough in your subject to go off script, that will get you a higher grade because it shows confidence and knowledge of the subject, and that's really what's being looked for more than anything else. A couple of things to avoid in your written work. The some theorists say. Yes, they do. But if you can specify the name of the theorist who says it, that will get you the grade.
On my feedback, it's like, which one, Danielle?
It's very easy to slip into.
In my criminology one, I put something like some theorists, such as whatever, and Barry put a note saying which ones, and I was thinking, went on to say,
Perhaps he attached the note to the wrong place in the assignment or something like that.
but would that be okay if I did?
Phrasing it like that is fine.
Yeah.
Maybe he was trying to attach that comment to somewhere else and he got it on the wrong bit of the assignment or something.
Yeah, so I was thinking.
But yeah, where you can, name names. That will bump up your grade. The one-sided argument bit's very easy to do, especially if it's something you're very passionate about. You write from like your particular kind of pet point of view. But if you can give some thought to alternate points of view, is there a different way of looking at this issue? Someone who disagrees with the first person you've mentioned who says something contradictory. Put both sides of an argument and then think. And then look at where the evidence supports. So who's right, this person or that person? Where does the evidence fall? That's what's going to bump your grade up. Citing to evidence. Which brings us, you'll be relieved to know, to the end.
Fantastic.
Any questions, queries?
Oh yeah. So on Turnitin, when it tells you if you've been or not, is there a percentage, like if it's over a certain percentage, that's that?
Well, if it's over 50%, we really start to worry.
Yeah.
We've had some people a lot over 50%. Where it really does look as if it's like the first 3 words and the last 3 words and are their own and everything else is pasted from somewhere else entirely. And that is a failing grade.
What if it's like completely accidental? Like I obviously don't plagiarize, but it's like when you go to an airport and they're checking you for drugs. I don't have them. I'm scared of accidentally plagiarize. Like what if someone, there's so many ways you can phrase.
Yes, yeah, that's a fair point. And if it's obviously that's the case, you just happen to have said something in quite a similar way to some other random person saying the same thing, that's not a problem. If you're at all unsure, there are free website services you can download like Quotations, where you paste. They're usually, because they're free, they're usually limited to word count, like the first 1,000 words, that kind of thing. So you paste in a section and it will tell you if what you've just pasted in is plagiarized or not, or at least is sort of accidentally matching to someone somewhere else.
But when you're reading, you know.
Yeah.
Before Turnitin, like you can tell.
Yes.
Very scared of authority. Never want to get that email.
If you're not sure, we can say there are other free services you can put things through and it will say, this is very similar to such and such a thing.
Don't worry, the cover sheet goes up.
Oh yeah.
Did you get a chance to read over what
I've read the start, but I will finish and then send you some.
I have got another couple of hundred words
Oh, right.
to go.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure that because I've taken out pretty much all of the direct quotes except that they're rich get richer and poor get richer, and I like that. So I've kept that in, but I've just